When we stopped talking yesterday, I left you off with the Proclamation of 1763, which came post French and Indian War. If you remember, a lot of European nations are going to be competing for land in North America. The 13 British colonies are going to prosper. They were founded for a multitude of reasons. We talked about political, economic, religious, and social reasons. And you do need to remember what colonies were founded for which reasons. But the conflict between England and France is what leads to the French and Indian War. As a result of this war, England gets a huge empire, but it's one that it can't effectively govern. And it also creates a massive amount of debt. If you remember, before the French and Indian War, Britain practiced a policy of salutary neglect with the colonies that kind of let them do whatever they wanted and didn't interfere with their affairs. That will change remarkably after the French and Indian War. England's going to expect the colonies to pay for this war. They're going to try to generate revenue through taxation, and they're going to impose some really restrictive laws. Colonists are going to find these laws oppressive, and they're going to resist them. They're going to coin the phrase no taxation without representation. They wanted representation in the English legislative body, which was Parliament. And as the British continue to assert their authorities, the colonists are going to protest, and eventually war is going to break out, which is why we call this the era of revolution or the Revolutionary Era. That'll lead us to the Revolutionary War. But this is not only a military conflict, it's going to be a shift in the way we think politically about government and how government should run. The Declaration of Independence states what we believe to be our rights and the equality that all men are going to aspire to. And it'll set off a trend of independence movements throughout the world. So let's look at some essential questions from this era. Why did England increase colonial taxation in the years leading up to the Revolution? Why did England move away from a policy of salutary neglect? Which colonial leaders stood out as the most vocal and the most radical? What British policies and laws caused the strongest colonial reaction? Why did the British government continue to tax the colonies without allowing them representation in Parliament? Why did the American Revolution become a battle of ideas rather than simply a military conflict? How did the Revolution affect women, blacks, and Indians? How did the Revolution create a new American character? So as we go through this Revolutionary era, we're going to look at these ideas. So let's talk about England and the colonies in 1763. If you remember that the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1763, it is going to give us all the land right here in the green, okay? So all of the land to the east of the Mississippi River will now be under British control. That is it more than doubles the size of the United States. So now instead of just having to govern these colonies along the Atlantic Ocean, they're going to have to govern all the territory to the east of the Mississippi River because we won the French and Indian War. The British economy is stretched pretty thin. If you remember, British Prime Minister William Pitt spent millions to defeat the French. They have a huge amount of debt. And they're going to need the colonies to help pay for that. The way that they're going to generate revenue is they're going to tax the colonies. They're going to expect them to help pay for the war. The colonists aren't going to see it that way. They see the taxes as not only way too high, but they feel that the taxes themselves are unfair. So groups are going to be created, and some will look like terrorist organizations, and their goal is to make the British repeal the taxes, take them away, and to stop taxing them. One of the things that the king is going to realize that he needs to do post French and Indian War is to reduce conflict in this territory. This shows the Proclamation line of 1763 right there. Ottawa Chief Pontiac begins a rebellion in the British territory that we had just gained from France up in this Ohio River Valley area. The rebellion is going to include attacks on several British forts and outposts, including Fort Detroit and Fort Pitt, but Pontiac is not going to be able to hold the tribes together. If you remember, all the Indian tribes were different, and they attempt sometimes to come together to resist the British. They don't do it very effectively. because of their lack of coordination together, the British are going to be able to crush this rebellion. And as a result, in order to reduce conflict later on, the king institutes the Proclamation Line of 1763. The Proclamation Line of 1763 says that colonists are forbid, not allowed, to settle west of the Appalachian Mountains. So this territory that they just fought for, that they're being taxed to pay for the war that got them this territory, they're not allowed to settle in. This is going to anger the colonists, and as a result, they are going to ignore the Proclamation Line of 1763, which will also result in conflict with the Indians in this territory. Let's revisit this idea of salutary neglect. I told you this was an important idea. Well, this was the unofficial British trade policy from the founding of Jamestown in 1607 until post-French and Indian War in 1763. Britain pretty much left the colonies to do what they wanted. After the French and Indian War, they move away from this policy of salutary neglect. Under the policy of salutary neglect, the British didn't bother to enforce many of their trade laws, and we'll look at a couple of them here in a second. They were on the books, but they didn't enforce them. The reason that they didn't enforce them is because they were too busy dealing with what was going on in Europe in order to focus their attention on the colonies. Once we take care of the French in the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War, and it ends in 1763, they can now turn their attention to the colonies. So England didn't restrict colonial trade. Colonial economies grew, and out of this grew this idea that we wanted an economy based on free enterprise, that we're allowed to trade with each other, to set our own prices for our goods. And when we have an idea of what free enterprise looks like, it's very, very different from mercantilism. The British government is going to leave the colonies alone during this time of salutary neglect. They're allowed not only to create self-government and control their own matters, but after the French and Indian War, the British are going to have to enforce these laws that were already on the books. England rethinks this policy of salutary neglect. They need the colonists to help pay down the debt, and the colonists are not going to like this. They're going to resist, and we're going to look in the coming days in class at the ways that they're going to resist these taxes. So the discussion questions I want you to answer in your notes are: what differences in views did the British and the colonists have about each other in 1763, and why? How did Pontiac's rebellion affect the relationship between the colonies and England, and why? And why did the British follow a policy of salutary neglect in regard to colonial trade? What led them to abandon this policy? I want to look at two acts right now, the Navigation Acts and the Molasses Act. These were passed prior to the French and Indian War, which is why I want to look at them right here. The Navigation Acts we've already talked about when we did our mercantilism activity, but they were designed to protect British and colonial shipping industries. They were instituted in 1651, and they required goods headed to the colonies or the mother country could only be shipped on British or colonial ships manned by British or colonial crews. And in the early 18th century, so the beginning of the 1700s, more laws were added that further restricted shipping and also prevented certain goods from shipment outside of the colonies. The Molasses Act, passed by Parliament in 1733, is going to make the colonists pretty mad. It places a high tax on molasses imported from the French West Indies. As a result, the colonists had to buy higher priced molasses from the British West Indies. Colonial merchants tended to lose money because the French molasses was no longer available at a cheaper price. And as a result, colonial merchants were frequently attempted to bypass the law by smuggling in French molasses without paying the tax. And if you remember from our mercantilism activity, this is what happened. If you wanted to get something cheap or not to have to pay the tax on it, smuggling is going to be a common practice not only in the colonies, but as we move closer to the American Revolution. That's all I have for you today. Make sure you've taken good notes and answered those questions, and we'll talk about it in class on Monday.